What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of Gamescript. This episode, I'm going to be looking at the Baltimore Ravens versus the Houston Texans. It is a game where the Houston Texans are huge underdogs, and we have a matchup between the potential MVP versus the potential Rookie of the Year. And I got some nuggets for this one that I think you guys will like, and I'll get into them after this. What's up, guys? Simon Edwards at Pumacom here with Heatseeker Sports, and you're watching Gamescript. Today's episode, like I mentioned, we're going to be looking at Baltimore versus Houston. They're playing in Baltimore with a 43.5-point total. Baltimore are 9.5-point favorites, so it's going to be a rough one for Houston based on the defensive matchup and the dominance of Baltimore's offense recently. And they have just been dominating every opponent from San Francisco on, like just all the guys that they've faced recently. They've been playing really well, and it's going to be a tough matchup for Houston. Before I get into the analysis, make sure that you click like on the video. Looking for 15 likes before I put out a shorter video, a little bit closer to lock with a little bit of final thoughts there. And subscribe to the YouTube page. I'm looking for 500 subscribers by the end of the playoffs. Right now, I'm at 430, so very close to getting there. Appreciate everybody who's subscribed so far. Sign up for Underdog. If you sign up for an Underdog account using the promo code SEEK, S-E-E-K, they're going to match you up to $100 on your first deposit. Just make sure to use that promo code SEEK. You may have to plug it in over their default promo code. And hit me up on Twitter if you do, and I will send you my playoff best ball rankings for the current round, which is the divisional round. And I think that there are a lot of edges to be had in playoff best ball right now, especially the way that I see people drafting in there. So let's move to this game. It's going to be a interesting game from a standpoint of, do we think that Houston, a high-powered offense that has been playing really well recently, will be able to play well versus Baltimore, which has a stingy defense and a high-powered offense themselves? It's going to be a tough matchup for Houston. They have been on fire lately, though, and I doubted them last week, and they ended up winning that game last week, obviously advancing to the next round of the playoffs. And we see them in a much tougher matchup this week. The first time these teams played, Baltimore ended up winning that game. That was the first week of the season, so I'm kind of ignoring that game altogether. They beat the Houston Texans 25-9. That was CJ Stroud's first ever game. And playing a defense like Baltimore in your first ever game, you're not going to win that game. So give a pass to CJ Stroud in that first game. I'm not going to even consider it in the analysis over here, other than maybe what the tendencies were of Baltimore to attack this defense. Although, Baltimore was in a much different situation too, because they blew this team out, and they didn't really need to use Lamar Jackson in that all too much. So we can maybe just ignore that game completely and focus more on what these teams have done throughout the entire season. So if we're looking at, the matchup on its surface, if you look at the matchup as far as their, let's see, I'm going to take a look at the percentage of man coverage that Baltimore actually runs. They run the fifth most man coverage in the league. They're at about 54% of their defensive play is man coverage. And that's not good for CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud has a very poor completion rate in man coverage. He's at 55%. His rating against man coverage is much worse than zone. It's 88%, or it's 88 in rating versus zone rating, which would be 112. So CJ Stroud has played much better versus zone coverage than man coverage. And it's unfortunate for him in this matchup with the amount of man coverage that Baltimore runs on their defense. But there are a couple guys on Houston that do really well in man coverage, and I'll focus on them in a minute when we're building this lineup. But first, let's go through all these players. Lamar Jackson, obviously, is going to be one of the higher-owned guys on the slate, probably one of the higher-owned captains on the slate, and there's a good reason for that. You can see, 39 DraftKings points against Miami his last time out. That was in Week 17. It's been a couple weeks since they even had to play a game. That is one thing that I get nervous about when these teams rest in the Week 18 bye, and then they have a bye in the wild card round on top of it. A team like Baltimore, I don't know what their situation is going to be like. They might come out super rusty because 19 days or however many days that they've had of rest in between games, that's a huge amount of time. And when you're not playing football games in that long amount of time versus Houston, which has been, playing for their playoff lives, they've already played about like 2 or 3 playoff games by now. They had to beat the Colts in Week 18 to advance to the playoffs. They ended up doing that. Not only did they advance to the playoffs, but luck swung their way and Jacksonville lost. They ended up winning the division. So they got that home advantage in the wild card round, and they ended up winning their wild card matchup as well. So Houston is well into the playoffs. They've had probably, you could say that CJ Stroud, even though he's only had one actual playoff game, he's played in about 3 playoff caliber games in the last few weeks, just keeping the team alive and keeping them, advancing as far as they did. So we're at the point where now they face off in a difficult matchup against Baltimore. And it's not good for CJ Stroud because Baltimore has a really good record against rookie quarterbacks. I believe Warren Sharp was saying that they're 17-2 under Harbaugh against rookie quarterbacks. So that is not good for CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud, though, is a different kind of quarterback. He's shown that he's, at least the season that he had, the rookie season that he had, is generational because, the guy was putting up like just ridiculous stats. And you can see in his DraftKings points too, 23 DraftKings points against Cleveland, which was a top-rated defense last week. Cleveland's defense did not play as well on the road, though, and they played in Houston last week. But Cleveland's defense, nonetheless, one of the top defenses in the league. Against Indy, he had 20 DraftKings points. You scroll down a little bit, you see he had 33 versus Jacksonville, 21 versus Arizona, 25 versus Cincy. He had a few other big weeks in there. Problem with CJ Stroud is against these tough defenses, 11 points in that Baltimore game that I told you I'm not going to worry about too much. Against Pittsburgh, he had a decent game. He had 24 DraftKings points. Against New Orleans, that's a tough defense. He had 15 DraftKings points. Carolina's a tough one, had 13 DraftKings points. So you can kind of pick these out. Denver is a tough one. He had 16 DraftKings points. Obviously, the Jets are a tough one. He had 3 DraftKings points against them. I believe that's the game where he got a concussion. Let's see. Other than that, Cleveland, another tough defense. He actually had 23, but like I said, Cleveland doesn't play as well on the road. So CJ Stroud struggles a little bit against these tough defenses, and that's going to be another strike against CJ Stroud in this matchup. things are not looking good for Stroud in this matchup. If we go down a little bit, we see Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers was banged up towards the end of the season. He was still putting up 20 DraftKings points a game in 4 of his last 5, as you can see here. He went through a little stretch there where he wasn't doing much, but he lit it up at the end of the season. He came alive at the end of the season. I guess you can consider him their number 1 receiver. He's a slot receiver, so we probably don't have to worry about Derek Stingley coverage too much, because Zay Flowers is running about, we'll get an idea of his slot routes. Zay Flowers is running 30% of his routes in the slot, and Stingley is a perimeter cornerback. Flowers also runs 60, he runs 70% of his yards from outside too. So he's not a complete slot receiver, but he runs more routes in the slot than Bateman or Beckham do. Those guys are each at about 12% in the slot and 80%, 90% outside. So those guys are going to be facing off against Stingley a lot more than Zay Flowers. And that's good for Zay Flowers this week, especially given his health now and his ability to put up those DraftKings points like we can see there. A couple of those games, he had 10 targets, 13 targets. He also had an 8-target game in there too. So Zay Flowers will be interesting tonight. And I believe he's the guy that Jackson is going to be targeting the most in the type of coverage that Houston runs. So we move on to Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary is a guy that you might want to reserve for situations where you're envisioning a Houston win, because they're going to need to get Singletary going in order to win this game. It's going to open up play action for them a lot more, and I think that's what they're going to need to beat Baltimore in this game. And Singletary will need to get going in order for that to happen. And basically, if you're writing a game script where Houston wins, you're going to want to consider Singletary. He is expensive, though. I tried to build a couple lineups with him already, and he's at 8,600. So it's tough to get him in there, especially when you're wanting to put in Lamar Jackson and Nico Collins. Stroud might be a guy that is the odd man out in this slate as far as the expensive guys, because it's really hard to get Stroud in there if you want to get these other weapons in. I like Nico Collins. I mentioned at the top that the defense that the Ravens are going to be running is man coverage for the majority of their defense. And Nico Collins is the guy who's favored in that coverage. On top of that, Marlon Humphrey is out in this game, so his matchup improves there. But Nico Collins, last few games, you can see, especially with Noah Brown out, Noah Brown will be out for this game. Nico Collins had 22 DraftKings points against Cleveland, 37.5 versus Indy, a few games of 15, but he's just had monster games throughout the season, and I would envision him being leaned on heavily in this game, especially with Stroud tendencies to have a consolidated target pool here. And I think Nico Collins is going to be obviously the guy who's going to be most targeted. And I think he should have a little bit of success against Baltimore, because every time you count this guy out, like we did in Cleveland last week, if you count him out, he's able to beat these matchups against tough cornerbacks. And I think that Nico Collins should do well in the game tomorrow, especially considering the volume that he's going to get. He might be the highest raw point upside on the slate. So Nico Collins is a guy that you're going to want to have some exposure to. Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards has been getting the majority of the work in the running game for Baltimore. When Keaton went down, Justice Hill started getting a little bit more. They just signed Dalvin Cook as well, and they activated him. So Dalvin Cook will be active tomorrow. and it'll be interesting to see how he's used. They wanted to try to get Melvin Gordon worked in the Week 18 game. I think the plan was to run Melvin Gordon throughout the entire game, but Melvin Gordon ended up fumbling on his third possession or his third carry, and they ended up running out Gus Edwards in Week 18, believe it or not, like a game that they wanted to rest their starters because Melvin Gordon fumbled. Gus Edwards and Justice Hill came into that game, and they got a ton of work. So Gus Edwards is a guy that should get a decent amount of work in this one, especially if they're playing with a big lead, and he's at 8,400. He's actually cheaper than Singletary for some reason. So Texans have been really good against the run. They're only allowing 18.6 DraftKings points a game to running backs, complete opposite of what they were last year. And to cover what Baltimore is allowing, they're allowing 18.6. So Houston is allowing 18.3 DraftKings points. That's what Gus Edwards will get. Singletary's getting 18.6 DraftKings points a game from the Baltimore matchup. So not very good matchups for the running backs in general here, but I wouldn't phase any of them out. I think they're all still in play, even with the rough matchups. All right, so let's move on to the next guy. Let's see. Mark Andrews is not activated from IR. There was speculation that he would play. He practiced this week, but it's looking more and more like he'll be introduced next week instead. That's good for Isaiah Likely, because I think Andrews actually knocked down what we should see in price of Likely. Likely's only at 7,200 this week, and he's been a go-to guy. He even got work in Week 18. They gave him a couple targets, but Week 17 he had 18 DraftKings points against Miami. You scroll down a little bit, he had 18 versus Jacksonville, 19 versus the Rams. So he's solidly taken over that role for Mark Andrews while Mark Andrews is hurt, and Likely has a good matchup in this one because Houston is allowing 14.1 DraftKings points a game to tight ends, and that's going to set up Likely to have a good game in this one. Definitely a guy that we want to keep in the player pool, and he's pretty cheap at 7,200. I like that price. Odell Beckham, he's in a similar situation. He has a few games where he's had some pretty decent weeks. You see 15 DraftKings points, 18 DraftKings points, 20 DraftKings points. I was reading an article by Evan Silva. Silva had mentioned that there were rumblings that Odell Beckham should get more usage in the playoffs, which makes a ton of sense. We saw that with the Rams too a couple years ago. And Odell Beckham's the type of guy that you preserve for the playoffs, given his injury history and everything. So don't be surprised to see Beckham have a nice role in this game. And at 6,600, he is cheap as well. So these Ravens weapons are pretty cheap. Dalton Schultz is, when we're looking at the targets that CJ Stroud's going to have in this game, basically the most competent targets that he's going to have are Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz. I like Nico Collins due to the way that he performs against man coverage. I mentioned it earlier. He's one of the favorite targets. On top of that, Nico Collins has the second best PFF grade versus man coverage, and he also has the fifth most yards per route run in the league versus man coverage. Dalton Schultz is not good against man coverage. He's not favored in man coverage. The guy that's favored in man coverage for the tight ends is Brevin Jordan. And when I was looking into this a little bit deeper, Brevin Jordan, we saw him get that 76-yard touchdown last week. Brevin Jordan versus man coverage has been, basically the favorite target, or one of the favorite targets of CJ Stroud. Brevin Jordan also has the third best PFF grade versus man coverage for tight ends. He has the second most yards per route run in the league versus man coverage. And on top of that, Baltimore is giving up 14 DraftKings points a game to tight ends. Brevin Jordan, I think, is going to be our sneaky play this week. He's at 2,800. I don't know if anybody else is talking about him or mentioning him, but I think that Brevin Jordan is going to be our salary relief guy this week. He's a risk that I'm willing to take at 2,800, given the need for a salary relief guy on this slate. And Brevin Jordan is going to stick out like a sore thumb with those matchups. And his performance versus man coverage, I like him a lot. I made a bet on DraftKings. Probably didn't get the best value on it. If you shopped around, you could probably get better value, but I upped his alternative yards to 25 yards, and I did an anytime touchdown for Brevin Jordan, ran it as a parlay, and we'll see what happens there. But I ended up getting, I think plus 1,200 or something like that on DraftKings. So if you want to check it out and tail on that parlay, or like at least one of those legs of that parlay, you can get pretty good odds on that. And considering that Brevin Jordan, he doesn't get many targets. You look at his targets, he doesn't get many targets. He got 4 targets versus Denver. That's his highest target rate on the year. He got 3 versus the Jets. He got 3 versus Cleveland. And he only got 1 last week, but it was that 76-yard touchdown. Don't be surprised if he gets a few targets in this one with his ability to play against man coverage. Baltimore runs man coverage at the 5th most in the league. And on top of that, he's just really good against man coverage. And he showed last week with that 76-yard touchdown, he has the ability to perform on top of the injuries that Houston is dealing with and the points that Baltimore is giving up to the tight end position, those 14 DraftKings points a game. Brevin Jordan, I don't need to say much more about that. So let's go on to Justice Hill. Justice Hill is obviously the I would say backup. He's probably the 1B to the 1A of Gus Edwards. He's more of the passing game guy. Last week 18, he had 10 targets in week 18. He only caught 3 of them. He had 5 targets against Miami. He had 3 targets for San Francisco, but also 10 rushing attempts in that one. So maybe he's a 1, much lower than Gus Edwards, but he does get a decent amount of work, and he's 5,600, which is pretty cheap. So if you're in a situation where you want to start one of those running backs and you can't afford Gus Edwards, I do think it makes sense to use Justice Hill in those situations, on top of Dalvin Cook, who we'll look at next. Dalvin Cook is only 1,200, another salary relief guy for us. They've wanted to bring in a third running back, or have a third running back that they can utilize throughout the season. They had Keaton Mitchell, who was breaking out, and he ended up getting hurt. They brought in Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook just activated. I think that was maybe part of, keeping Marlon Humphrey inactive, or like Mark Andrews keeping him on IR or whatever. They had a roster spot. They're bringing up Cook for the game, and at 1,200, he's cheap. He showed no upside in the Jets. The Jets' offensive line is awful, though. Like, you saw it every play. The offensive line was breaking down. They didn't give you any room at all. And I think Dalvin Cook, being an older guy, just suffered because of that. He should have more success in Baltimore if he's given the opportunity. So Dalvin Cook, he's a salary relief guy that you can keep in mind. Him and Lamar go back too. Him and Lamar are, I think, both from the Florida area. So they have a history together, and they're buddies. So we'll see what happens with Dalvin Cook in this game. If we scroll down a little bit more, we got Bateman. Bateman's been, one of those guys that hasn't done too much. Guy that the fantasy community had big expectations for basically the past couple seasons. He has not delivered, and now they have better receivers in Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham, but don't rule out Bateman as a potential to do something in a game like this. But at the same time, I wouldn't bend over backwards to get him in my lineup at 5,400, considering he has barely cracked 9 DraftKings points once all season. So nothing to write home about with Rashad Bateman, overpriced guy that would only be a rotational guy in my opinion. If you have that amount of salary left and you want to rotate him in with the kickers and Justice Hill and stuff like that. Justin Tucker is a stud. He's had, look at that stretch he had there from weeks 11 through 16 where he had double-digit points in all those games. Cincinnati, Chargers, Rams, Jacksonville, San Francisco, to give you an idea of the types of defenses where he was scoring those points. Also had 19 versus Tennessee, 14 versus Seattle. Justin Tucker is probably my favorite guy in this range. I will take him by a mile over Bateman and Hill for that matter. Fairbairn is another guy, another kicker, good kicker, solid kicker. 16 points against Tennessee, 17 versus the other game against Tennessee, 15 versus Atlanta, 12 versus Pittsburgh, 13 versus Jacksonville. If you think that they're going to be able to move the ball against a tough defense like Baltimore, where they won't be afraid to try to take points where they can, Fairbairn is definitely in play for this game. Look at the Ravens D, 4,400 for that defense. They've had a few weeks over double-digit points, decent amount of weeks actually. 10 points versus Miami, 15 versus San Francisco. 15 versus San Francisco is pretty damn good. 15 versus the Chargers, 14 versus Cleveland, another solid team. 15 versus Seattle, 14 versus Detroit, 11 versus Tennessee, 17 versus Cleveland, the other game they played, and 11 versus Houston. So Ravens D definitely in play, and they're pretty cheap at 4,400, considering how good they've been this year and how CJ Stroud plays against man coverage. So be interesting to play the Ravens D. Nelson Aguilar, I even like him probably more than Rashad Bateman. Look at the targets he's been getting. He got 5 targets in week 18. That obviously was the game they were resting their starters. 2 versus Miami, 4 versus San Francisco. He had 5 versus the Rams. So he pops off every once in a while. He's had a few weeks over double-digit points. He's doing much better than Bateman. 17 versus Cincinnati, 10 versus Pitt, 10 versus Cincinnati, and then 10 versus San Francisco. He had 9 DraftKings points against Pitt last week. So Nelson Aguilar is definitely in play, especially at 4K. We're looking for salary relief. It's a decent price there. Robert Woods, not too much interest in Woods. I think that if they're going to attack the middle of the field, it's going to be with the tight ends. And I don't like the matchup that Woods has because he's on their best corner in the slot. So Woods will be a guy that I probably don't have a bunch of exposure to. Mechie, I prefer Mechie. Mechie's been coming on recently. Last week he had 3 targets for 44 yards. He's had 2 targets before that, 3 targets, 5 targets in there. With Noah Brown out and Tank Dell out, they got to get one of these other receivers to step up. Nico Collins can't do all the work. I'd look for John Mechie to step up. And that's why I like Brevin Jordan too, because you're not going to be able to throw the ball 100 times to Nico Collins versus Baltimore. I think that you're going to have to get Mechie involved and these secondary guys. They're going to go to the guys who they've had the most success with. I think that's Mechie, and in a man coverage, maybe Brevin Jordan does pretty well in that game too. Talked about him. Texans D, they've had some good weeks too. 21 points against old man Flacco last week. 21 versus Tennessee a few weeks ago. 13 versus Tennessee the other game. 10 versus Denver. They're run by D'Amico Ryans, who had a lot of success with San Francisco's defense. And, as the head coach is the Texans, guy's been on fire, and he's turned that defense around. That defense was a joke last year, and now they're one of the top defenses, especially against the run. So Texans defense, I would keep them in play. Lamar Jackson's not mistake prone, or he's not mistake prone, but he's not mistake proof either. All right, so moving on to the next game. Our next guy, we're looking at Pierce. Not really interested there. Brevin Jordan's about as low as I go. Hutchinson, you could play Hutchinson if you need a guy for 1,800. Not sure if I'd prefer Cook or Hutchinson. I think you got to kind of just make a call there. Look on the beat writers and see what they're saying about the amount of work that Cook is going to get. But Lamar Jackson was pretty excited that Cook was joining the team, if you think that's worth anything. Other than that, I don't see a ton that I like. Steven Sims, I'm surprised he didn't get as much work with all these guys being hurt. And that is about it for dumpster diving. So the dumpster dive, I think the lowest I go is probably Dalvin Cook at 1,200. So let's start doing this build. We'll do one with the chalk build first. I'll take a look at the optimizer. They got Lamar Jackson in the captain spot. Take a look at the rest of it. They got Mechie, the Ravens D. Ravens D. Couple cheap options that we talked about. Justice Hill, Isaiah Likely. And then you can use your imagination for the last guy. You can get Nico Collins, you can get CJ Stroud, you can get Zay Flowers, whoever you want there. So that is basically where the optimizer is taking us. Not a huge fan of this build. I think that we're kind of limited by going that pricey, but the other option for me would be Nico Collins in that captain spot, and he is pricey as well. Let's get him in there. Let's get Jackson in there. Let's take out Hill. See who else we got. Yeah, if you do that, if you go in that direction, look at what that opens up. We got Jackson to Likely. We got the Ravens D. We got Mechie and Collins in there. And then we can throw in Odell Beckham for good measure as another one of our guys. Let's get out Mechie and let's put in our guy Brevin Jordan and see what that opens up for us. Gives us 7,500. Still in that Beckham range. We leave some on the table in that situation. But if we do that, let's put Beckham in there. Leaves us with 5,300. You can get Tucker in there. I like that lineup a lot better. Nico Collins in the captain. Brevin Jordan's in there. Odell Beckham. We got Jackson throwing to Likely and Beckham. And then we're got the Justin Tucker in there too. That would make sense why we don't have Lamar Jackson in the captain. Maybe he's not converting as many touchdowns because you're getting field goals. Likely and Beckham are getting PPR points. Jackson is getting rushing yards in addition to passing yards, and then maybe he runs in a touchdown. And then Justin Tucker kind of mops things up for them. Meanwhile, in catch-up mode, the two guys that have a lot of success in man coverage are getting targeted. Brevin Jordan, maybe he catches 3 targets for 30 yards and a touchdown. And Nico Collins goes for a lot of volume and maybe a touchdown or 2 as well. So that is a good direction to go. If you wanted to go a little bit different, let's get rid of that. Let's go with like Beckham and the captain, because I do think Beckham has a lot of upside, obviously. You could also go likely in the captain. Let's go likely in the captain. Let's go likely in the captain. Let's give him Jackson. Let's get Collins in there. Let's get Stroud. Let's get our guy Brevin Jordan in there. See where that leaves us. That's going to leave us with 3,400 in that direction. If you wanted to go the Texans D, you could do that. I'd like to get another 200 in there, so we could swap out likely and put in Beckham. And then that gets us 4,300 left. Leaves us with Nelson Aguilar and John Mechie and Texans D, same spot that we were in earlier with those lower guys. But I don't mind this build at all. Jackson to Beckham, and then Stroud to Collins and Jordan, and then we got that extra play, whichever direction that we want to go there. I think that's a pretty good direction. I do like likely in this matchup. Probably, I don't know if I'm going to say I like him better than Beckham, but I do think that likely has a really good matchup in this one, and Houston is allowing 14 DraftKings points a game to the tight end position. Same with Baltimore. Basically, they're both allowing 14 DraftKings points a game to the tight end position. So we got Brevin Jordan represented in there. I just can't get likely in this lineup. But if you wanted to do what I was saying earlier, if you want a Houston build where they're able to keep this competitive, maybe Singletary's in there. Leaves us with 5,900. Can't quite get to likely in that one either. We need another 1,300 to get to likely there. If you wanted to knock down Brevin Jordan, which I don't like doing, I like Brevin Jordan a lot this week. Let's say we go with Cook. That'll get you likely in there if you wanted to throw Cook in there. So I mean that would get you Lamar Jackson to Beckham and likely, running it back with Singletary and Collins. I think that would be a script where it's a little bit closer maybe. Nico Collins is getting the most work on the Houston side. Singletary is getting the touchdowns, which is keeping Stroud out of this lineup. And then on the other side, you got Lamar Jackson throwing it to Beckham and likely. And then Cook is in there. Maybe Cook gets a touchdown or something. So a few different ways that you can go there. Should be a good game, at least from the Baltimore side. Not sure what Houston's going to do just yet, but there are avenues for Houston to win this one. We've seen CJ Stroud defy expectations all season, so don't be surprised to see him do it again in this game. We see Baltimore rusty. We see Lamar Jackson. He's got that monkey on his back for playoff games where he hasn't won a playoff game yet. And I think this is the year for Lamar to do it. Guy got ignored in the beginning of the season when he was a free agent, basically. They put the franchise tag on him, I believe, and then made him available for a trade. And none of the other teams even considered the trade. A lot of cronyism with the ownerships of these teams. And it wasn't cheap to obtain him. They'd have to pay probably 2 number 1 draft picks or 2 first-round draft picks in addition to a bunch of money. But the fact that no teams were willing to do that, considering you got teams in the spots like the Atlanta Falcons and stuff like that, where they've had first, top 10 picks in the last few years, and they haven't done anything effective with those picks, with Arthur Smith as the as the coach, things like that will change. But the situation they were in at the beginning of the year, they could have done that trade for Lamar and ended up with an MVP type of quarterback, because the guy put up another MVP season. It's probably going to be a second MVP in the last few years. So rooting for Lamar Jackson to kind of stick it to everybody who doubted him. And, we'll see what happens in this game. But make sure to hit the like button. Get me to 15 likes. I'll put out a shorter video. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube page. I need about 70 more subscribers till I can hit 500. So I appreciate all the help with getting to that number. And make sure to sign up for an Underdog account using promo code SEEK, SEEK. And you can hit me up on Twitter at Pumacom. Send me a DM. Let me know that you signed up, and I'll send you my rankings. All right, guys. Good luck. Oh, and I got a whole bunch more game scripts coming up. I got one on there with Spread Astaire already for the Tampa Bay game, and I'll have the rest of these game scripts up before their games start. So good luck, everybody.